something truly intriguing: what the world's major powers actually did with China and why it matters today. World powers that tried to carve up China in the 19th century actually, and completely unintentionally, laid the groundwork for the superpower it is today. It sounds crazy, right? But the story of modern China is filled with incredible twists of fate, where every attempt by Western empires to weaken it somehow made it stronger. This isn't the history you learned in school. This is the story of how humiliation fueled a revolution, how foreign domination sparked a national identity, and how the Century of Humiliation accidentally forged the China we see today. Let's rewind to the early 1800s. The Qing Dynasty, once a mighty empire, was showing signs of decay. It was a vast, self-sufficient land, but its leaders were complacent, unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. Great Britain, with its powerful navy and insatiable hunger for trade, saw a massive untapped market in China. The problem? China didn't want what Britain was selling. They were happy with their own goods. But the British had something the Chinese couldn't resist: opium. The British East India Company began flooding China with opium grown in India. It was a wildly profitable but morally bankrupt trade. Millions became addicted, and silver, China's primary currency, flowed out of the country to pay for the drug, crippling the economy. The Qing emperor, seeing his nation crumble, finally decided to act. He sent an official named Lin Zexu to Canton, who famously seized and destroyed over 20,000 chests of British opium. The British were outraged, not because of the drug trade, but because their property had been destroyed. This was the excuse they needed. In 1839, the First Opium War began. Britain, as modern steam-powered gunships and well-trained soldiers, were no match for China's outdated junks and traditional armies. The result was a devastating defeat for China. The Treaty of Nanking, signed in 1842, was the first of many unequal treaties. China was forced to pay a massive indemnity, open up 5 port cities to foreign trade, and most humiliatingly, cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain. This treaty marked the beginning of what China now calls the Century of Humiliation. But here's the first twist. By forcing open these treaty ports, the Western powers didn't just bring in goods. They brought in ideas. Missionaries, traders, and diplomats brought with them concepts of science, democracy, international law, and nationalism. Chinese intellectuals, for the first time, began to look outside their Middle Kingdom and compare their own society to the West. They saw their nation's weakness not as a temporary setback, but as a deep-seated crisis. The very tools of Western dominance technology, political systems, and economic theories were now being studied by the Chinese as potential tools for salvation. The humiliation didn't stop with Britain. Other powers like France, Russia, Germany, and even Japan wanted a piece of the pie. The Second Opium War, rebellions like the Taiping Rebellion, which was one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history, and the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 all chipped away at Qing sovereignty. By the end of the 19th century, China was being carved up like a melon, with different powers claiming spheres of influence where they held exclusive trading and railroad rights. It seemed like China was on the verge of complete colonization. And this leads us to the second, and perhaps most important, ironic outcome. For thousands of years, the average person in China didn't think of themselves as Chinese in the modern sense. They were subjects of the Qing Dynasty, loyal to their family, their clan, and their village. The idea of a single, unified Chinese nation was a foreign concept. But as they saw foreigners carving up their land, building railways through their ancestral graves, and acting as if they owned the place, a new, powerful feeling began to emerge: nationalism. The constant foreign encroachment created a common enemy. People from different provinces, who spoke different dialects and had different customs, suddenly had a shared experience of being subjugated by outsiders. They began to see themselves not just as Han or Manchu or Cantonese, but as Chinese members of a single nation under threat. Sun Yat-sen, often called the father of modern China, harnessed this rising tide of nationalism. He argued that to resist the foreigners, the old corrupt Qing Dynasty had to go. It had to be replaced by a modern republic. So, the very act of imperial aggression, intended to divide and conquer, ended up uniting the Chinese people in a way that nothing had before. It created the very idea of the Chinese nation-state. The fall of the Qing Dynasty in 1911 didn't end the humiliation. The new Republic of China was weak and fragmented, ruled by warlords. When World War I ended, China hoped that the Western powers, who had spoken of self-determination, would return the German concessions in China. Instead, at the Treaty of Versailles, they were handed over to Japan. This betrayal sparked the May 4th movement in 1919. Students and intellectuals across China protested against foreign imperialism and their own ineffective government. This movement was a critical turning point. It radicalized a new generation of Chinese youth. They debated fiercely. Should China follow the path of Western liberalism, or was there another way? It was during this intellectual ferment that a new ideology arrived, one born from the industrial struggles of Europe, Marxism. For many disillusioned Chinese, it offered a powerful explanation for their predicament. It wasn't just foreign countries, but the entire system of global capitalism and imperialism that was oppressing China. And it offered a solution: revolution. Among those inspired by these ideas was a young man who had worked as a library assistant at Peking University, Mao Zedong. The Western powers, by pushing China to the brink, had inadvertently created the perfect breeding ground for radical revolutionary thought. The founding of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921 was a direct consequence of this century of foreign pressure and internal decay. Over the next few decades, China was torn apart by civil war between the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists, led by Mao. The brutal invasion by Japan in World War II only added to the chaos. But ultimately, it was the communists who emerged victorious in 1949. They succeeded where the Qing and the nationalists had failed. They unified the country, kicked out the foreigners, and ended the Century of Humiliation. Mao's government was built on a foundation of intense nationalism and a deep-seated desire to never again be weak or pushed around. The very memory of the Opium Wars and the Unequal Treaties became the founding myth of the new China. It justified extreme policies, from the Great Leap Forward to the Cultural Revolution, all in the name of building a strong, self-reliant nation that could stand up to the West. The West had created its own ideological rival. So when we look at China today, its fierce protection of its sovereignty, its ambition to lead in technology, its massive industrial power, we can trace the roots of it all back to those British gunships sailing up the Pearl River. The attempt to break China open for trade ironically triggered the birth of Chinese nationalism. The imposition of Western systems ironically provided the very intellectual tools to resist the West, and the Century of Humiliation ironically fueled a revolution that created one of the most powerful and centralized states in modern history. It's a stunning example of unintended consequences, a story where the actions of empires boomerang in the most unexpected way. The West didn't plan to create its greatest competitor, but by trying to dominate China, they accidentally did just that. Thanks for watching. If you found this journey through history as fascinating as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe InfoTalkings for more stories that change the way you see the world. See you next time.